She reached the front door of the complex 15 minutes later. Siren's weight hadn't bothered her at first, but the last 100 yards were difficult, her pace slowing significantly. Using one hand to steady the man on her shoulder, she dug in her pocket and retrieved her keys. Unlocking the door, she twisted and turned her way inside, and carefully made her way up the stairs. She reached the apartment door and promptly dropped Siren into a heap on the floor. She felt a flare of satisfaction roll through her. She'd been concentrating so hard to keep from tipping over that she didn't even realize the front door hadn't closed behind her. The unexpected sound of footsteps startled her, causing her to drop her keys. She turned toward the source and felt her heart drop to her stomach. No. Lit by the overhead entrance light, Grayson watched her from the doorway. What the hell was he doing there? He glanced to Siren on the floor, then back to Addison. By the look on his face, he'd seen her drop him on purpose. Without a word, he made his way up the steps and retrieved the keys by her feet. He reached past her and unlocked her apartment door before holding them out to her. Her breath caught in her throat. This was the last thing she expected. Well, actually, Siren was the last thing she expected. But it seemed her expectations were being surpassed tonight at a staggering rate. At some point, she would cease to be surprised. This was great. Just great. She held out her hand and Grayson dropped the keys into it. He took Siren's shoulders as she grabbed his feet and they made their way inside. It was a straight shot to the couch and they set Siren on it face down. They moved to flip him over onto his back. Addison didn't stop to talk just then. She immediately went to a kitchen drawer and took out a roll of duct tape. Yanking at the folded end, she pulled a long strip loose. Sit him up. Grayson did as she asked, and she proceeded to wrap layer upon layer around Siren's chest and midsection. Satisfied with the top, she moved down to his knees and ankles. When she was finished, she had Grayson lay him down. The vampire was still unconscious, and probably would be for a while yet. She stood, her breathing heavy. She knew she should say something, but her mind was blank. She was still trying to wrap her head around Siren's appearance. And now she had to deal with Grayson, too. Her night was getting better by the minute. So, Grayson broke the silence. What kind of trouble have you gotten into? Addison let out a half-laugh, half-sigh, a defeated sound with a slight hysterical edge to it. Strangely, she was more surprised that he was talking to her than by him being in her living room, let alone that he'd just helped her tie up a stranger. She shook her head in defeat. What lie would he believe? A mugger she'd bested? An obsessed ex-boyfriend she was getting rid of? It's a long story, she said. He glanced down at the man lying unconscious on her couch and assessed the situation. He looked back to her, his unique eyes penetrating hers. I've got time. She drew in a breath as she raised her eyebrows, deciding on the best story. This wasn't going to be easy. Anything she told him would sound crazy. You'll probably just think I'm insane. Well, he hesitated a moment. I don't expect everything a vampire says to make sense, but I'm sure you'll make it convincing. Good night. I'll see you tomorrow. The cashier called over her shoulder as she walked out the gas station's door. Her shift was finally over, and all she wanted to do was go home and crawl under the covers. Her apartment beckoned her from only a few hundred yards away. Slinging her purse over her shoulder, she shoved her hands into her pants pockets and looked down as she walked. The night was quiet and clear, the rhythm of her feet slapping the ground and her breathing were the only sounds beyond a few chirping crickets. She was halfway to her building when she heard muffled footsteps from a distance. Out of habit, she looked over her shoulder and saw a woman walking 50 feet behind her at an unhurried pace. She thought nothing of it and returned her attention to the ground in front of her. A few moments passed before she heard a soft tune float through the air. Not expecting the sound, she looked up and frowned, turning her head slightly to the side. Immediately, she realized where the melody was coming from. The woman behind her was whistling. She suddenly felt perturbed. She didn't know why the feeling came over her, but the whistling was unsettling and out of place. There was nothing menacing about it, but there was something in the tune that made her uneasy. It was just an odd thing to hear on her walk home. The perturbed feeling started to make her anxious, and suddenly she just wanted to be inside her apartment. She wanted to speed up her easy pace, but she wasn't sure what the woman behind her would make of it. There was no apparent reason to be afraid of her, especially in a small town like Quiet Brook. She didn't appear threatening, but the whistling was almost foreboding. It made the cashier apprehensive. She had the vague sense that this was what prey felt in its gut when it was being stalked by an unknown predator. Addison forgot how to breathe. She forgot how to do everything except stare at Grayson in total, utter confusion. She blinked several times as she searched his face. "Excuse me?" She couldn't have heard him right. It was just stress making her hear things. It had to be. "I know who you are, Addison," he said. She eyed him warily. "Yes," she replied hesitantly. "I'm your coworker." The corner of his mouth twitched with the tiniest smirk. "Let me rephrase," he said, then looked her straight in the eye. "I know what you are." Nope, she hadn't imagined it. He did say vampire. She shook her head, feigning confusion. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "Yes," he replied. "You do." Addison felt panic start to set in. She needed to defuse this situation, convince him he was mistaken. Deflection was the first thing that came to mind. "How much have you had to drink?" "You know what? It doesn't matter. Let me call you a cab," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "Management won't mind if you leave your car here for the night." If he was busy trying to convince her he wasn't drunk, he couldn't continue with his accusation. She turned to grab her phone off the kitchen counter. She needed to get him out of the apartment immediately. 4 months ago, you and Naomi moved here after spending 5 years in Baltimore. Before that, you were in Wilmington for 2 years after living in Lexington for 6. Addison stopped dead in her tracks, her hand frozen on her phone. Her heart skipped a beat, possibly 2, she couldn't be sure. How did he know where she and Naomi had been? Anxiety flared in her chest, and she tried to remain calm as she slowly turned to face him. Her eyes were wide in disbelief. She saw him watching her expectantly, like he was challenging her. "How did you know that?" she asked in a whisper. "That's when I started tracking you," Grayson replied. "Tracking? What in the hell is he talking about?" "Why would you be tracking me?" she demanded, finding her voice again. She was losing her calm, and defensiveness wasn't going to do her any good. "Because it's my job. I was assigned to keep watch over you 8 years ago when your former guardian died." Warning bells went off in her head and the anxiety spiked. Her tone turned angry, dangerous even, as she took slow, menacing steps toward him. "Who assigned you to watch me?" "Easy," Grayson said, putting his hands up to placate her while he held his ground. "I'm not with the Union if that's what you're thinking." Addison stopped dead in her tracks. She felt like she'd had the wind knocked out of her. There it was, his proof with just one word. There was no point in denying the truth. He knew about the Union, which meant he really did know who and what she was. Now, she needed to know exactly who he was and what he was doing there. Her expression sobered as her anxiety was quickly replaced with determination. "Then who are you with?" "An organization," he replied as he lowered his hands. "Made up of several resistance teams. We monitor vampire activity in the area." "Humans watching vampires? Since when?" "That's not possible," she replied. "Humans couldn't find vampires without detection." "Could they?" She frowned at the thought. "The resistance was formed almost 2 centuries ago, when humans first became aware of vampires. Information has been passed down through the years. They kept tabs on the Union." Addison blinked in surprise. This was sounding like some sort of secret society. "How did they find out?" "Someone witnessed a feeding and managed to warn others. They didn't know exactly what they were dealing with, so they started doing reconnaissance." He casually tucked his hands in his pants pockets, continuing before Addison could reply. "At first they thought it was some kind of a plague that was causing people to act different. Even witchcraft was considered. They thought that if they watched the afflicted, they could discover a weakness without putting themselves or the rest of the city at risk. Eventually they managed to capture one and fill in some of the blanks." Addison shook her head. Even knowing the facts, who would have believed them? If what Grayson told her was true about the time the resistance was formed, she would have at least heard of it. Word would have spread like wildfire, even by the end of the war. If resistance really did exist back then, they hadn't made themselves known. They knew it would have created a hysteria if people found out, so they decided to keep it a secret and to deal with it themselves. That was the start of the resistance in the first team. This was a lot to process in such a short amount of time. Addison thought she knew everything that had happened 2 centuries ago. She'd been there, after all. How many members are there? Grayson glanced to her left, staring almost blankly when he spoke. It's a global operation. Locally, my team has 10 members that keep tabs on the city. Altogether, maybe 50 to 70 people within a 100-mile radius. His eyes returned to her, watching for her reaction. Addison felt her jaw drop and her eyes widen. How could she not know about this? She turned and began pacing in front of the balcony, her reflection following her in agitation. She passed the door several times, mulling over everything she'd just learned before stopping in front of Grayson. Why are you here? Why tell me all of this? Because you gave me no choice, he replied, his voice filled with regret as he glanced at Siren lying unconscious on the couch. He looked back to Addison and said, especially after what happened last time. She cocked her head to the side. Last time? She was frowning again. He hesitated. Hillsdale. The frown left her face. No, it couldn't be. Addison, he said earnestly, the regret still there. I know what happened. How? The word was barely audible as it escaped her throat. I was there. What? Confusion filled her voice. You're the only vampire we know of who's escaped the Union and survived. The others we've seen try were all hunted down by its members. I don't know how you did it, but once we realized they wouldn't be able to catch you, we sent a tracker after you. We've been monitoring you ever since. He was watching her closely now. She focused on the floor in front of her as she absorbed what he was telling her. She wasn't expecting any of this, least of all that she was being watched this whole time. So you saw me. You saw what happened. She looked up and searched his eyes. I did. Emotions conflicted inside her head to the point of numbness as she tried to fit in this new information. Her eyes focused on the floor again, noticing the individual threads of the carpet while not really seeing them at all. She realized this was what shock must feel like. She looked down at Siren. I take it you were with me during my walk? Yes, he said after a moment of silence. She turned her eyes back to him, scrutinizing his words. And you're supposed to watch me. Make sure I don't hurt anyone? When he nodded, she asked, Then why didn't you show up when he first approached me? She motioned with her thumb at Siren. Because I don't jump to conclusions, he replied, then hesitated a moment and said, But I will say I was a little nervous when I saw him following you. Obviously not on my account, Addison said dryly. No, Grayson admitted. When the two of you started talking, I realized you knew him. A wry smile crossed his face. Especially after you decked him a couple of times. She stared at him in confusion and shook her head in disbelief. How can you be so glib about all of this? He cocked his head to the side and raised an eyebrow. Why wouldn't I be? Quiet amusement filled his voice. Addison's disbelief turned to irritation. Because right now you're talking to a killer who preys on your kind. If I were in your position, I wouldn't be so nonchalant about it. Perhaps, he allowed, like he was humoring her. But then again, you're not like the rest of your kind. You may have killed before, but statistically speaking, you're not a serious threat. Addison couldn't believe her ears. He had to be joking. She wasn't a serious threat? He just said it himself that she'd killed before. What was a more serious threat than that? She stared at him, completely baffled. Isn't your team supposed to prevent that kind of thing? You know, vampires killing people? That goes without saying, he replied. Her brow furrowed as frustration set in. Then why did you let it happen? Knowing now that she hadn't been alone at the park that night, that he could have stopped her from hurting that boy, what she wouldn't give to turn back time and have him change fate. She felt her throat tighten at that horrible thought. What if? She was left stunned when he suddenly abandoned his indifferent exterior for the first time since they met. With a slight fall of his brow and a grimace set to his mouth, she witnessed in him a sympathy she hadn't thought him capable of until now. In that one look, her view of him shifted from a strange enigma to something more tangible, more human. From that one look, she couldn't take her eyes off of him. He let out a long, sad sigh. "I didn't let it happen, Addison," he answered in quiet earnestness. "The unfortunate truth is that I was just too late catching up to you." She felt the tightness in her throat loosen its grip minutely. "Catching up to me?" "After you and Naomi left the theater that night, I followed you home at a distance. When I got to the apartment, I saw you walking toward town while Naomi stood in the lot, watching you go. I couldn't risk her seeing me follow you, so I had to wait for her to go inside. When she finally did, you were out of sight. I had a feeling you would head to Hillsdale, so that's the direction I went. But by the time I got there," he hesitated, and regret was obvious in his eyes. "It was too late," Addison said quietly. She gave him a slow nod as she let the awful truth sink in, that no matter if she'd been alone or not that night, the end result wouldn't have changed. Somehow, acknowledging this fact caused her guilt to weigh even more heavily on her mind. But as the guilt weighed in, she came to the realization that she had been wrong before. It wasn't sympathy she saw in Grayson's face. It was empathy. She wasn't the only one that Hillsdale weighed heavily upon. "Whether you believe it or not, one mistake doesn't condemn you," Grayson said after a few moments of silence. There was a sincerity in his voice that she hadn't heard from him before. It just sounded so odd. When she didn't respond, he said, "We knew it was only a matter of time before your control slipped, so we're not holding it against you. At this point, you're not a serious threat, especially when we have a much larger problem to deal with." "What are you talking about?" Her voice was quiet. Grayson crossed his arms, and the sincerity and empathy she saw before was gone. He was all business now. "Union member activity has increased recently. They've been leaving the base in groups of 2 or 3 on a monthly basis, sometimes weekly. Each group is gone for days at a time before they return with new members. Some of them are going so far as to cross state lines, and they bring back at least 1 new vampire with them each time. So far there have been 11 reported cases. According to the teams in those outer areas, these aren't established vampires they're bringing in. They're turning them on sight. Since the Resistance obviously doesn't have access to the base, we have no idea what they're doing with these new recruits, or why they're bringing them in at this rate. We were hoping you could give us some insight." Addison didn't know what to think of all this new information. This was the second time tonight someone had approached her about the Union's dealings, and they were 2 of the most unexpected people at that. Why did either of them think she would be of any use? They were asking the wrong person. Confusion creased her brow again. "I'm not sure what it is you expect from me exactly. I don't belong to the Union anymore, and there's no way in hell I'm going anywhere near it again," she said, repeating what she told Siren earlier. When would people start believing her? "I'm not asking you to breach the Union," Grayson said reassuringly. "It's information we need. You had access to the facility, and you know how the place operates. Right now, we don't even know the layout of the base. We have limited information, and it looks like we're running out of time. We need you to fill in some of the blanks." Still frowning, Addison gave him an unsure shrug. "I don't know what good it'll do. I mean, I haven't been inside the Union in years. The layout may be completely different by now. What about its operations? Do you think management would be running a different show now?" She shook her head. "Not likely." She placed her hands on her hips as she recalled the centuries she'd spent in that pit. The members came and went over the years, but overall the place had stayed the same. Chances are it was still the hell she remembered. She let out a resigned sigh. What harm would it really do to tell him what she knew? He already knew she was a vampire, so anything beyond that probably wouldn't shock him. After a few moments of silence, she said, "Okay, I'll tell you what I can." Grayson looked relieved at her acquiescence. Anything would be helpful. She nodded once, hesitated momentarily, then motioned toward the kitchen table. "You may want to have a seat. This'll take a while." They sat opposite each other at the table, and Grayson started his line of questioning. He asked about the size of the Union, what the hierarchy was, and an estimate of member numbers. Addison decided it would be easier just to map out the structure sometime to give his team at least some idea of its dimensions. Disdain was obvious in her voice as she told him about Brescia and Jaren, along with the positions other members had to keep the main population in line. When she mentioned the role of the mentors, She brought up Siren's involvement. To her surprise, Grayson wasn't aware that Siren had been involved in her abduction. "How did he get you into the Union in the first place?" he asked curiously. "I'd gotten involved with the war on a local level. This area and the rest of the coast was hit pretty hard with British troops, so I did what I could to help." "What war?" he asked. She hesitated, a little surprised by his question. He'd said they'd been watching her for a while, but he also told her they didn't start until after her escape from the Union. This meant he probably didn't know anything about her life prior to her abduction, including the reason for her involvement in the war. She preferred he didn't find out. Her voice was a little unsure when she spoke. "The War of 1812. His eyes widened a little, and he looked slightly taken aback. "Really?" he said, as he thought about it. "We were curious about your age. I didn't realize you were held in the Union for so long." There was a brief pause before he returned his attention to Siren. "So what was going on when he showed up?" Addison pulled in a breath and said, "The war was just coming to a close. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed a couple of months before, but it took a while for word of it to reach the city. One night around that time, Siren came to my door and said he had news of a possible ambush by the British. He said he was sent to round up citizens for a meeting to prepare for the attack. I made the mistake of trusting him." "The Union sent him after you?" Grayson asked. When she nodded, he frowned. "Why you?" "I only wish I knew," Addison confessed, her eyes turned to Siren's limp body. "I'm planning to find out, though."